I wanted to just give a brief introduction to the readings for this week and sort of prep you for the quiz. You do have a quiz to complete this week. So if we look at the two readings assigned for this week, one by David Grazian and one by Henry Jenkins, both of them are really talking about issues of fandom and fan production, but also a number of other things. And I think these two readings really do a good job of summarizing some of the topics we've covered in this course to this point and preparing us for discussions of globalization. Right, so I'm just going to gloss over some of the things that I think are key connections in here. So if we look at Grazian's article in particular, he's interested in questions of cultural authorization. If you recall, we started with this right way back in chapter 2 of Interrogating Popular Culture. And the idea of cultural authorization is that there are gatekeepers, right? There are official forces who do their best to determine what can be legitimately called culture within a society and what should be marginalized or considered non-culture or degraded culture in the society. And so one of the things Grazian talks about early in the chapter are culture wars, and these you should think of as examples of these processes of authorization, right? What we end up with is a set of official spokespeople who are trying to dictate what counts as culture for other people, and then you have fans who respond to it. And one of the cases he talks about is the attempt to censor heavy metal music in the 1980s and about the appearance of defenders of heavy metal before Congress at a congressional hearing. One of those defenders was Dee Snider, who you see here, of Twisted Sister. And I put up a little clip from that testimony, which is taken from the documentary, a documentary called Headbangers, which is a history of heavy metal. So if you're interested, you can take a look at that. But this, this really takes us back to chapter 2, issues of cultural authorization, what counts as official culture, what gets marginalized within society, and how do those power struggles play out. Right? Grazian also talks about reception theory, what we've called reception theory. That is the notion that consumers are not just passive sponges absorbing what cultural industries produce, but rather they are active producers of meaning themselves. They make sense out of the resources that cultural industries provide. And they do this both individually and in what we call interpretive communities. Grazian is very interested in these interpretive communities for this week, as is Jenkins. Jenkins calls them fandoms, but fandoms are a type of interpretive community. Right? So as you're reading Grazian, make sure that you can define interpretive community and think about what's the connection between an interpretive community and a reading formation, as we've discussed that concept. This is an example of one. I did not put this on the blend space because I didn't want to overwhelm you, but if you're really interested in what fans can do with the text, you might look at this online fan adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It's absolutely fantastic, and it's really fabulous. So I highly recommend it, particularly if you're a fan of Jane Austen. Right? Grazian also talks a lot about identity and affect, which we've talked about for the last 2 weeks. Right? Identity, as we've discussed it, is a social construction, which is not to say that we, that society marks out a place for us and we simply inhabit it, but we make do with what the society provides for us. So these questions about identity formation, identity as a performance, identity as related to group identifications, right? All of these things come back up in this chapter, and he uses Morrissey to talk about some of these processes. Morrissey is a British new wave singer, really. Very soulful singer, and his music doesn't seem to have much to do with Latino experience in California, and yet he has this enormous fan following among Latino audiences in California. And so the question is, what are these Latino fans, Latino and Latina fans, doing with Morrissey, right? How are they identifying with him? Why are they identifying with him? What makes them care about Morrissey? And in part, it's, of course, his emotionality, right? He himself cares. And so they're identifying with that affect. Right? Grazian also talks about the issues of authenticity, and what you'll find is that he defines authenticity as a type of performance, that there is no authentic self. There is only a performance that seems to adhere to the expectations of the audiences before whom we perform. Right? he uses food to talk about this. So he says, for example, if you walk into a Mexican restaurant in the United States and you don't have chips put on the table, tortilla chips put on the table right away, you might question whether this is a real or a genuine or an authentic Mexican restaurant. But in fact, there is no food tradition of providing tortilla chips before a meal in Mexico. Right? So this is a tradition that has been invented in the United States and it has assumed a kind of authenticity for us. But there is no ground to that authenticity. Right? It is a performance. Having been repeated often enough, it becomes an expectation, and if a restaurant doesn't then live up to that expectation, we might question whether it's an authentic Mexican restaurant. Right? And then he brings up these notions of hybridity, or melange, or what we're going to call transculturation, which anticipates some of the discussion of globalization in the next chapter. Right, so hybridity is basically the idea that you take two or more cultures and you marry certain elements of them to create a new hybrid version of culture. Right? And arguably that's what Morrissey fans, Latino Morrissey fans, are doing. Right? They're taking a little bit of their Latino heritage and the songs of Morrissey, who is British, working class British white guy, right? And they identify with selected parts of that music. Then they use that music to form a community of interest, which becomes itself a sustaining part of their lives, right? It becomes a subculture for them. Okay? So authenticity and hybridity. Think about the relationships between these two terms, the way that we tend to think about authenticity is as a fairly conservative phenomenon, often is associated with tradition and the upholding of traditions. Right? But hybridity is actually about creating something new out of the old, about combining elements of older cultures into a new third thing. And then we come to Jenkins, and Jenkins revisits a lot of our discussion of the cultural industries. Right? So he starts off by talking about media convergence and using a political economy model to talk about media convergence. This is a nice little infographic that reminds you what we're talking about here. We're talking about those forces of conglomeration, which have resulted in our media system going from over 50 companies providing news and information and entertainment to us in the 1980s to 6 in 2012. From Jenkins' perspective, convergence creates certain conditions within the industries that encourage synergistic media productions, right? So productions that can be displayed across a variety of media on a variety of different screens, that can be spun off into soundtracks and video games, books, magazines, cartoons, whatever, and all along the way, the media corporation can be making money off of these multiple properties. Jenkins is also interested, though, in the flip side of this, which he calls participatory culture. And we can liken that to our discussion of the moral economy of fandom in that same chapter. Right? There is, on the one hand, this corporate phenomenon whereby there are fewer and fewer corporations controlling more and more of our culture, but the flip side of that is that they're producing more and more complex texts for us to work with, which requires us to do more and more activity, which makes us more and more active, right? So that we become very literally producers of our own culture. And we start to think of it as ours, right? We claim ownership over it in a way that has traditionally been taboo within the cultural industries, right? Cultural industries have traditionally tried to hoard ownership over their properties in order to make money off of them. But increasingly they have to let fans in or risk becoming irrelevant. So he's interested in these power struggles between the corporations and the people, the fans, who make sense out of the cultural resources. He's interested in fan films, so what we call vernacular creativity, going all the way back again to chapter 2. Right? And these graphics kind of get at some of the tensions here, right? There's this notion that George Lucas, who you see here, is a representative of the empire, right? Trying to squash the Rebel Alliance, control ownership over the Star Wars franchise. And the fans, on the other hand, are the rebels, right, trying to fight back. Now, Jenkins brings this up really to problematize it. Right? It's not actually that simple because corporations have given away a lot of authority over their texts, and increasingly fans have asserted their right to work with the texts in certain ways. And there actually is a continuum of relations that have emerged between corporations and fans, and the continuum spans from this complete lockdown on intellectual property rights to a complete openness and collaboration between corporate producers and fan producers, whereby, to go back to the Lizzie Bennet diaries, right, I think it's Disney actually has made now a book out of that and a DVD that you can buy of the series, right, so they've co-opted or collaborated with the fan producers of that series to actually produce something that they can make a profit on, right? So, that's hardly the empire versus the rebellion, right? All right, so we want to think about what are the various power struggles that are going on here. And that's pretty much it for today. I put up a list of questions for you to look at on the blend space. I also put up a couple of things that I hope you'll find interesting. One is Chuck Klosterman's discussion of the Morrissey fandom. If you're really interested in that subculture, he really digs down into the reasons the fans are so obsessed with Morrissey. As I said, the Twisted Sister testimony in Congress in the 1980s is available to you. I also put up a little clip from the Dave Chappelle show called When Keeping It Real Goes Wrong, which gets at these questions of authenticity and genuineness and what it would mean to be real or to keep it real. And then finally a little clip, and you don't have to read this, it's just FYI if you're interested, but there's a new Star Wars reboot coming out, and there's a lot of controversy around it about the production staff. The fans feel like they're not being contacted enough, and they're worried, of course, about what's going to happen to their beloved franchise. All right, so if you're interested in that, this is a great article from The Atlantic about that controversy.